Our second session will be chaired by Elliot Ginsburg from the Frankel Center and the Department of Judaic Studies, and also Near Eastern, or now Middle Eastern Studies.
Yes.
They keep changing their name each year. So thank you all for being here this morning. The second session on Andalusi self-fashioning. Elliot?
Ryan, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here because unfortunately I invariably when there are the presentations, I somehow manage to teach at exactly that time. So I'm very, very grateful for this opportunity, and excited to have two papers, one by Ross Brann and another by Moshe Yagur, and I think we will have question time after each paper because they're probably disparate enough. We'll see. And if there's any leftover time after that, then we will just take additional questions on the whole. And so it's a pleasure to welcome, to introduce Ross Brann, who has been here as a Frankel Fellow this year, working on Sephardi and Andalusi exceptionalism. And Ross is a really distinguished professor of Judeo-Islamic studies, really one of our leading scholars in the intersection of Muslim and Jewish cultures in Spain, the author of multiple books, including ones on Hebrew poetry in Muslim Spain and on the representation of Muslims and Jews in Islamic Spain. Today, he's going to be talking about one of my favorite poets of medieval Spain, the master of Maqamat, although you're not going to be talking about that, I understand. Yehuda al-Harizi, a self-styled Andalusi Arabist-Hebraist from late 12th, early 13th century Christian Toledo. And I think just unpacking that title itself would be a fascinating talk. So rich.
That's the talk. Thank you. So my role in this year's group of fellows is to bring us back to seriousness of our purpose, typically. And people who've been in the group know what I mean by that. I would love to talk about some of the really hilarious stuff in Al-Harizi, but not today, in keeping with what I just said. I looked on the internet for, try to get some images to convey a little bit about this rather interesting individual. This is the best I could come up with. I'll tell you about that over lunch. Around 1215, the Arabic and Hebrew literary intellectual Judah al-Harizi trekked from Arabophone Toledo in Castile via Provence and a sojourn there to the Levant in the Islamic East, where he ended his days in Aleppo as an Arabic poet. His voyage is intertwined in complex ways with the corpus of texts he authored during his travels. Al-Harizi's readers typically question the purpose of his trip and the motive for his writings, for writing the works informed by the journey. He supposedly set out in search of Jewish patrons whose diminished largesse, here you can see a little bit of the terrain he traveled, a bunch of different maps, I'll come back to those. He supposedly set out in search of Jewish patrons whose diminished largesse eluded him in Castile. That rationale number one, occupies a prominent place in Al-Harizi's rhymed prose writings. In Tahkamoni, the collection of Hebrew maqamat, rhetorical and picaresque anecdotes, he finished composing in the Islamic East, and in his interrelated Judeo-Arabic prose works authored during the same period. I prefer to pose the question somewhat differently. How do Al-Harizi's writings illuminate his literary identity? I speak of literary identity as opposed to identity, as Ryan has reminded us, a theoretically compromised term in some quarters. Literary identity makes no ontological claims and does not presume to recover or to know what the author actually thought, felt, or intended. Rather, critical analytical interrogation of texts in all their thickness, ambiguity, and dissonance can produce a sense of the author's discursively constructed literary identity, informed in this case and in almost every case by considerations of artistic ideology and practice. Apart from Halevi's search for patrons, his works present the reader with a complex, even jumbled picture of what the author-traveler claims to seek and imagines he will find in embarking for lands beyond his homeland. In Provence, for example, Harizi presents himself as an emissary of Andalusi Jewish culture. Embracing the practice of mujawara, disseminating knowledge, he presumes to educate and enlighten Provençal literary and religious intellectuals in Hebrew and Arabic culture. That's rationale number 2. However, profound socio-religious and intellectual frictions in which Harizi was embroiled loomed large in Provence. The Maimonidean controversy and Harizi's professional rivalry with Samuel ibn Tibbon as a translator of Andalusi Jewish philosophical and scientific works from Arabic into Hebrew. Under these circumstances, some scholars say Judah is thought to have followed intellectually minded Provençal rabbis among his supporters and intimates who left for the East in the hopes of conferring with Abraham Maimoni in Cairo. That is rationale number 3. By contrast, Harizi's introduction to Kitab ad-Durar, 1221 to 22, the Book of Pearls, a Judeo-Arabic prose account of his journey east, characterizes his motivation in transparently conventional Arabo-Islamic terms as pursuit of knowledge, talab al-ilm, and for the prospect of absorbing wonders, ajab, these words are in what we'll read in translation, found in far-off lands. Rationale number 4. There I was at the age of ambition, ere had waned the wish to wander, in order to sip the wine of wisdom and gather the blooms of knowledge, longing greatly to attend the meetings of the learned, like this one, and to hear of marvels of distant lands from the lips of strangers, kind of like some of the tales of woe that we've been exchanging about our own university homelands this year. The first of Tachkemoni's Hebrew dedications to patrons sets forth yet another purpose for the journey east and the work. The author's impassioned dedication to a Hebrew linguistic and literary program, a commitment Harizi hoped to discover and market among the Jewish communities of the East, who would surely appreciate his mastery of Andalusi Hebrew culture and support his literary endeavors. However, Tachkemoni's first Hebrew introduction dedication also decries the Jews, the Eastern Jews' preference for Arabic over Hebrew, and assigns Harizi the sacred task of reviving the holy language and inspiring Jewish literary intellectuals to embrace his cultural agenda. Written in Arabic, the third dedication is unsparing, and the issue of the dedications is one of my favorite gimmicks, and actually takes us back to the entrepreneur of his literary identity. He got 3 distinct patrons in 3 different places to subvent his work. We should all be so lucky. Although I'm up to 2 between Cornell now and the University of Michigan. So I guess. Written in Arabic, the third dedication is unsparing in its pessimistic perspective of his prospects for success. I have noticed that most of the Israelite community in these lands of the East are devoid of the Hebrew language and denuded of its beautiful garments. If one of them were asked about a Hebrew word, it would seem as if he were being addressed in a foreign language. This disease continues to spread among them to the extent that most of them are never capable of putting the Hebrew letters together. They need to take Hebrew 101 here at Michigan. Initially, the text expresses nothing but utter contempt for the prominent people and poets of Eastern lands. They're vilified for their avarice and parsimoniousness, their obtuse anti-intellectualism, inept and amateurish poets, and their immorality. He's pretty relentless. It represents the Islamic East once home, as Mark reminded us, once home to the very centers of Jewish life and scholarship, as an intellectual and cultural backwater, especially with respect to its community's command of Hebrew and in comparison with the Jews of Al-Andalus. A subsequent stage of textual revisions indicates Al-Harizi appeared to come to terms with his new surroundings. The Easterners are praised for their largesse, their scholarship, and their moral stature, but this was a temporary accommodation, according to the testimony of his very last composition, The Pleasant Garden, dedicated to the Jewish community of Baghdad, in which he grumbles, "It turned its back on me." For their part, Al-Harizi's meticulous, albeit very positivist editors of all of the Hebrew and Arabic texts attribute to Judah, quote, as the purpose of his journey to describe all the Jewish communities from west to east. That would be rationale number 6. And would that they had read Martin's work, they would have not fallen into this grave error of assuming that this was simple reportage. Indeed, the text described more than 50 Jewish communities, including Alexandria, Cairo, Akko, Sfat, Damascus, Aleppo, Edessa, Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra, and others. They also mention by name more than 200 Jewish notables and poets in the East, real figures, most of whom we know from the Geniza or from other documents. To complicate matters even further, Tachkemoni's dedicatory poem alludes to Judah Halevi's pilgrimage lyrics, this is in honor to Ehud, and thus suggests a more pious motivation for Al-Harizi's trip to the East. His land was the garden of God, now exiled and banished from its fields. He left the land of his sojourn and raced trembling to the land of the Lord. His name is known as Judah ben Solomon, the name of his land and homeland, Sfarad. Judah Halevi's prose formulation that he uses in a letter to a North African, an Egyptian dignitary, he referred to himself, quote, as one whose homeland is Sfarad, but whose destination is Jerusalem. Sfarad admato v'Yerushalayim megamato, certainly struck a literary chord with Al-Harizi. In Tachkemoni, the fictional narrator responds to a query about his place of origin by rephrasing Halevi. Sfarad is my land, the land of Israel is my destination. Sfarad admati ve'eretz hatzvi megamati. These allusions sufficed for 2 great scholars, Sherman Fleischer, they're now one scholar, to conclude that the purpose of Halevi's voyage was surely a Halevi-inspired pilgrimage. As is well known, the individual installments of Tachkemoni are discontinuous, detached rhetorical anecdotes and do not represent a journey at all, but rather irregular meanderings of the linguistic, imaginative, and textual kind. Tachkemoni claims to be further dissociated from the author's experience and voice through the mediated reportage of its 2 conventional fictional personae, the characteristically staid and gullible narrator, Haman the Azrahite, and the uncommonly eloquent and provocative trickster protagonist, Hever the Kenite. Tachkemoni is not, as some would have it, an account of Halevi's travels. From a literary critical perspective, efforts to alternately identify either Haman or Hever with Al-Harizi, depending on what scholars call autobiographical descriptions of a particular maqama, are overdetermined. Despite its professed fictionality, though, Tachkemoni intersects with Halevi's own travels. Indeed, the genre serves as a perfect literary vehicle for the itinerant author because its stylized form is predicated on movement and wandering, and its conventional themes include discovery, wonderment, and foreignness. In a different sense, ghorba, but in a different sense than we heard. Most significantly, Tachkemoni reflects Judah's dogged pursuit of financial backing from the mercantile elites of the Mediterranean Jewish society and represents his ideologically minded reading of Hebrew literary history when it surveys Jewish communities and their cheapskate patricians. Maqama 12, miserliness and generosity. It's a literary debate between these 2 qualities, and all of the Jewish communities of the East side with miserliness in this maqama, this staged debate. And the inept, I'm going to remind the new provost of a very august sister institution to keep this in mind in support of the humanities. And the inept versifiers he encountered in the Islamic East compared to Sfarad. In Maqama number 3, the appraisal of the poets of Al-Andalus, and in Maqama 18, the era of the Hebrew poets. In particular, the appraisal of the people, Maqama 46, two versions of which have come down to us, resembles a travel narrative. Resembles is the key word. It draws directly on the author's itinerary, and we can see that back here. It draws directly on the author's itinerary, transforming, as it were, his movements into literary form, as the rhetorically gifted grifter, Hever the Kenite, revisits all of Al-Harizi's way stations from Toledo to Lunel and from Marseille aboard ship to Alexandria and points east. Thanks to the Arabic and Hebrew text grounded in Al-Harizi's journey, and to Joseph Sadan's discovery of an entry on Al-Harizi in a biographical dictionary of Arabic poets, recent readers of cast Judah's journey as a form of cultural refreshment, much like the spiritual refreshment Andalusi Muslim travelers bound for the Islamic East sought in response to changing and often unsettling social and political conditions in the West. Did I? No, that's one. Thank you. Several of Al-Harizi's readers thus ascribed the wanderlust that drew him eastward as an indication he expected to feel more culturally at home in an Islamic society and a fully Arabic-speaking environment than was possible in turn of the 13th century Toledo. That's rationale number 8. For her part, Rina Drori identified Al-Harizi's writings as products of new cultural circumstances in Christian Spain and Provence, in which Andalusi tradition, Arabic employed for communicative and Hebrew for ceremonial purposes, was replaced completely by Hebrew exclusivity. That would be rationale number 9. Not for the trip, but for the composition and related compositions. While extremely insightful, this functional instrumentalist scheme does not entirely account, in my view, for the complexity of Al-Harizi's literary identity, informed by his travels and experiences, expectations and disappointments, and above all, by his ideology and linguistic practice. After all, Al-Harizi left Toledo and Provence for the Islamic East, where he stayed for the whole last part of his life. Finally, Michael Rand's recently published study of the Tachemoni's intricate textual history identifies literary penance with Hebrew displacing Arabic as strongly implied rationale for undertaking its composition. And of course, and this is what Elliot alluded to, as imaginative and rhetorical literature, Tachemoni means, above all else, to entertain and make a buck. Judah al-Harizi, literary opportunist, cultural emissary, Arabic-speaking literary and religious intellectual, out of place in Provence, pious pilgrim, Hebrew bard in search of Eastern patrons, foreign ambassador for Hebrew in the East, professional poet for Muslim and Jewish aristocrats, author of detailed travelogues, seeker of expiation for literary sins. It's dizzying. We can find in these works textual evidence justifying each of these portraits of the author. How can we make sense of this array, really a disarray, of assessments of Al-Harizi and his literary identity? The key to deciphering Al-Harizi's unstable, evolving, and multiply constructed literary identity lies in reading his works as social texts and as literary responses to his journey in dialectical relationship with his ideological commitment and his mission. For this reason, I'm especially interested in the texts representing Al-Harizi's depiction of his interactions with and assessments of various audiences, as well as his professed ideological commitments and actual linguistic literary practice. Let me continue to try to unravel this confusing chaos of the author's ostensible purposes as traveler and poet by discussing the most important formal and conceptual elements of the Jerusalem Maqama, whose literary oddities have been overshadowed by its solemn subject. I think you'd be happy I'm taking us back to Jerusalem. Then I will briefly note the significance of Al-Harizi's assessments of the Jewish socio-cultural scene in the Islamic East compared to Al-Andalus, the artistic ideological bearing of Tarkamoni's introductions, and the interrelation of all of these elements in affording us a somewhat clear picture of his literary identity near the end of his life. Here's how I outline the Jerusalem Maqama. Haman, who identifies in the text himself as a Jew from Sfarad, tours the holy city as a pilgrim. The next segment. Haman then recites a very long poem, which is actually a composite of different themes, but which I'll just call for now a lament for Zion. I want to draw our attention to the incipit of the poem, which is begging to be acknowledged in counterpoint to the theme of the poem itself and the theme of this particular maqama. Nefesh Tzion misfarad galta. A soul from Sfarad was exiled to Zion. There was actually an earlier reference to something like this in my talk. So then we have this poem, and then he's made himself very disconsolate about the current state of affairs in Jerusalem until he encounters a Jerusalemite who then gives him a very brief history lesson, recent history, and concludes his history lesson with a prayer. Don't do this in the classroom. He concludes the history lesson with a prayer for an end to unspecified communal strife and turmoil in the Jewish community in Jerusalem. And then finally, very, very briefly, the recognition scene typical of nearly all of the maqamat, a recognition scene of Hever as the Jerusalemite, and then the requisite leave-taking between the two fictional characters. If Jerusalem is a place unlike other places, does an imaginative text relating Haman's visit differ significantly from the Tarkamoni's other rhetorical exercises, anecdotes, narratives, encounters, and adventures set in other locales? For one, the narrator Haman rarely assumes so prominent a role as the protagonist Hever. Yet Haman's voice and perspective dominate the first half of this maqama. So too, for a trickster who lives by his wits, street smarts, and rhetorical genius, Hever's demeanor in this maqama is uncharacteristically sober, consistent with the theme. And anagnorisis, the artistic ploy central to the maqama's narrative structure, falls utterly and completely flat, lacking any sense of its customary deception, double-dealing, trickery, surprise. Indeed, the reader senses that these lapses in convention and inversions draw attention to a significant paradox. Hever the Kenite is an otherwise ubiquitous figure in the collection of 50 maqamat, who alchemically, as it were, turns up in every place, but who belongs to no place. He is never rooted in a particular land. He has no watan, not even the land of Israel. He is, as his biblical surname alludes, a restless wanderer in the land, much like the voyager Al-Harizi himself. Here and there, the reader finds very minor textual gestures inviting some sort of identification of author with one of the two characters. In Maqama 39, for example, Hever the Kenite sets out to visit Sfarad. He is drawn there by accounts he says he's heard of its many marvels. In several installments, Hever appears as a champion activist for Hebrew, supposedly as a surrogate for the author. Yet the itinerant bard Al-Harizi also invites the reader to identify the author with his narrative figure, Haman the Ezrachite, the Jew from Sfarad, whose very different surname suggests rootedness in and attachment to place, a singularly important place in Al-Harizi's literary and geographical imagination, Sfarad. Indeed, the Jerusalem Maqama offers the reader two contrasting perspectives of the holy city in the early 13th century, in keeping with the genre's rhetorical strategy of juxtaposing conflicting points of view. That of the visiting Sephardi pilgrim who views Jerusalem through the ahistoric, exilic prism of Jewish religious tradition and liturgy, and that of the city's permanent resident involved in all its messy social and political life. Haman and Hever, and thus Sfarad and Jerusalem do not stand in opposition, but rather represent complementary figures, milieus, and geographic emotional poles in the Tarchemoni's poetics of cultural identity and place. Maqamas 13 and 18, devoted to the literary history of Hebrew poetry and poets, Andalusi in the first instance, and in much greater length, Andalusi and Eastern in the second, along with the introductions, represent transparently ideological gestures of Sephardi elitism. Maqama 3 evokes two critical tenets of the trope of Andalusi Sephardi exceptionalism, noble genealogy, and climatic theory, going back to 10th century Cordoba, and lauds the Andalusi Hebrew literary tradition as the exclusive, transcendent paradigm for the production of elegant Jewish culture. Now, since some of the tribe of Judah escaped to Sfarad, as it is said, and the captivity of Jerusalem that is in Sfarad, Ovadia verse 20, is directly opposite the middle of the heavens under the equatorial realm. I don't know what map he was looking at, but there were also in Spain scholarly men in all the sciences and the art of poetry, both metrical verse and rhymed prose. Therefore, their Hebrew speech was preserved in its purity. And that also goes back to the interpretations of the Ovadia text that the Jerusalemite elite were the sole guardians of the Hebrew language for posterity. And they turn up in Sfarad, of course. Maqama 18, also set in Jerusalem, recounts Hebrew literary history more elaborately and relates how the Jews came to compose Arabic-style Hebrew verse. The protagonist, Hever the Kenite, appears in the guise of a sage, again holding court at a majlis. It's too bad that Samar Ali had to leave, because that's what he's written about. It is another instance in which he attributes the development of Arabized Hebrew poetry to principles critical to the origins and trajectory of the trope of Sephardi exceptionalism, articulated variously by Ibn Shaprut's court poet surrogates, Samuel the Nagid, Moses ibn Ezra, and Ibn Daud, among others. A noble genealogy conferring Jewish leadership and stewardship of Hebrew, along with geographical climatically favorable land, bestowing capacity for producing sophisticated culture. He adds a glowing portrait of Chasda ibn Shaprut, inaugurating Sfarad as the epicenter of Jewish intellectual life in a pseudo-prophetic enterprise. I love this one. He, Chasda, issued a proclamation, "Let he who is for the Lord, let him come to me." This is, of course, the prophet Elijah and the prophets of Baal, the false prophets of Baal. "Let all his wants lie upon me. Then every great scholar and every sage gather unto him from Christendom and Islamdom, from east and west. From that time on, the sciences in Sfarad made a breakthrough. In his day, culture spread throughout Israel, for he was a patron and a liberator of learning." The ambiguities and inconsistencies and ambivalences we find in Al-Harizi's interrelated texts afford us clues to his complicated, multiply constructed literary identity. Rather than attempting to reconcile these ostensible contradictions of motive and purpose, the text set forth, I read them as a representation of the rich creative paradoxes that characterized Andalusi Jewish culture. In particular, the thematic inconsistencies of Al-Harizi's work signal the author's complex, artistic, ideological, and evolving pragmatic attitude rooted in Andalusi Jewish cultural ideals, values, and practices that the author claims as his very own and from which he derives his own cultural authority. Born in a Christian polity 200 years after the era of Ibn Shaprut, and thus removed temporally and geographically from his models, Al-Harizi's literary identity offsets dedication to Sfarad with devotion to Jerusalem, and balances Arabic expertise and an ideological commitment to Hebrew with full knowledge of Andalusi Hebrew literature's deep structural relationship to Arabic. Al-Harizi's self-fashioned literary identity as curator of Andalusi Jewish tradition represents him as a zealous heir to Sephardi cultural capital and defines a foreigner in Eastern lands as a self-styled Andalusi abroad.
So, That was beautiful. Thank you so much for a serious yet entertaining talk.
Well, rather than talking about the misogyny and the cantor,
The cantor
who doesn't know his Hebrew.
Right. There's time for a number of questions, but just to make clear, we're going to 12:30, not to 12, as it says on the program. This is an hour and a half session, as all of them are. So, Ehud?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that we need to dedicate a whole group to Harizi. Maybe in 2 years' time, as a group of translation will be actually dedicated.
Oh, what
to
a great
Harizi.
idea. See, I looked at Sarah when you made that announcement, but maybe there's room for all of us. Somehow I have a feeling some of us will be welcomed back more readily than others.
But I want to raise the issue of the nature of adab, of this Arabic adab. And I think that, in a way, you see that the adab genre, or maybe it's larger than the genre, was in itself restless. So an adabist is always jumping from subject to subject. He's not really into any subject really in a serious manner. So in a way, you can see, we can actually understand Harizi of being actually the perfect adabist.
Yes.
Who actually manifests in his life, the adab ideal in such a way that he was also restless, not only in his writings, like all the adabists, but also in his life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yes, please.
Yes, I have a question about the fact that Harizi was born in Christian Toledo.
We think. We know he lived in Toledo.
Lived there.
We don't absolutely 100% know he was born there, but most likely, 1165.
For how long did he spend there?
We're not sure. At least his period of growing up and the earliest parts of his young adulthood. But before the turn of the 13th century, he's already in Provence. He's in Provence for quite a while, does not leave Provence until 1215.
So it's really curious to me that, I understand there's a certain continuity and yet change, but consider that Toledo had been Christian for almost 100 years at that point, and of course Provence was Christian. Yet he still thinks Al-Andalus is one, even though politically it's been fragmented.
Right.
I'm just curious whether, having lived in Christian Spain, if it left any mark on his personal identity or his literary identity.
So the answer to the second part is yes, sort of, because although he claims to be an heir to all those Andalusi poets, even if we just take away the rhymed prose, which doesn't make an appearance in Hebrew letters until relatively late with Ibn Saqbel, already on the cusp of the Christian period. So it is, it's later than the poetry proper. But his poetry is, while drawing inspiration from the Andalusis, it differs in style. And his audience is different. And undoubtedly that's reflected in his work. The first part, I have two answers to. So Rina Drori, who was really principally an Arabist and then started looking at Judeo-Arabic materials, had this structuralist way of looking at it, that social change brought about a wholesale abandonment of Arabic in the Christian context and thereby revived Hebrew exclusively. And that in her view, Al-Harizi is a product of that. I think it's more complicated than that, because if it were only that, he would never have needed to leave Toledo or Provence. Part of it is the question of market for his works. Who are his readers. We do know pretty well that the earlier phase of his career, he's mostly a translator from Arabic into Hebrew. So he's earning a living as a translator. At some point, he makes this jump maybe his experiences, his failed experiences as the most preeminent translator in Provence, and he becomes no longer a translator, but a belletrist. But he thinks clearly, I mean, I said I don't know what he thinks, but he does take a trip. So something is drawing him to the east, and I've given you all of the different ways of interpreting that. And I think all of them together are motifs in Andalusi Jewish Advent. They're all there in some poet, in some whatever, in some text. And I think the Makama is a perfect vehicle for touching all those bases, because it allows him to expound on everything. So Jonathan Dechter also has written that, emphasized the different socio-economic, socio-political, socio-cultural environment. I think one can show that really clearly with the other authors, many other authors from the same period and thereafter, less so with Al-Harizi, because the paradox is he's so tied to the Arabic. And in fact, ironically, or maybe not in some way, he finds towards the very end of his life, and I won't say, but you could figure out how old he is. When I look at that number, I start getting very scared. He's an Arab poet the whole last several years of his life. He gave up trying to find enough Jewish patrons in the East to pay for his Hebrew writings. He found some, because we have the 3 dedications of the Tachkemoni, and some of the other things, but it wasn't enough. So what does he do? He goes back to writing Arabic poetry and finds both Muslim and Jewish aristocrats in Syria who'll say, oh yeah, we love that stuff, keep it coming, here's a nice check.
Wow. I'm going to ask Ryan a question here. Ryan, we're at about the halfway point. We started 10 minutes late. Is there time for one more question, or should we?
So, and then we'll
Then-
a little from Moshe.
Then we'll move. Absolutely. Want to leave? So please.
Thank you, Ross, for taking us on this lively journey with Al-Harizi. As you have shown us, Al-Harizi, in a metaphorical way, goes constantly back and forth between Sfarad and the Mashriq, the Muslim East.
Exactly.
And as you didn't want to talk about his satire of the cantor, his portrait of a cantor in the Jewish East who watches.
Mosul. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, who watches the Hebrew morning prayer.
Right.
Is this just satirical, or does it express certain feelings of his about the East? Does this express his own notion of Sephardi exceptionalism? And if so, how can it be reconciled with the fact, as you say, that he made his home ultimately in the East?
Great questions. The answer to is it a feature of his commitment to Sephardic? Absolutely. Clearly he exaggerates. So one of the poets that he names in the East is Habavli, who is, okay, he's not by any estimation a literary star, but he seems to be put up as, from the Easterners, as here's our greatest living poet. He's not. I mean, he may be there in their view, but Al-Harizi is pretty clear that these Easterners don't know anything about poetry, and it's only the provenance of the Andalusis. So you have this, again, it's a paradox, that everything is rooted, centered from Al-Andalus, but he's there literally in exile from it, in all of these various communities that he's going back and forth from. What he actually thought, other than I do take his very harsh critiques of the cultural scene there to heart. I mean, this is his estimation, partly conditioned by his disappointment with their stinginess. So that maybe they weren't quite as bad, but he lets them have it because they're so stingy. But as far as the cantor goes, the Israeli positivists all say that is based on an experience he had when he went to synagogue one morning in Mosul. How could they possibly know that? How could anybody possibly know that? It's a picture. It's an imaginative tale, perhaps based on an experience, perhaps not. I mean, in Al-Hariri, we have Muslim preachers who are taken, to task for being, having no competency in hadith and sunnah, and yet they're spouting on and on. Islamic prayer is a lot easier to lead than this cantor and Jewish prayer in the morning. It's longer for one, but he botches the Hebrew, which is not his native language, different in the case of the Arabic. So who knows? Like you, I'm very suspicious of any positive readings of any of this until people like Moshe, who's next up, tell me they found some documentary evidence from the Geniza saying that the cantor in Mosul was removed from office because he couldn't perform his tasks. Is that a good transition?
Yeah, that's perfect. It can't be better than that. So let's transition now to Moshe Yagur, who teaches at University of Haifa, of course, is here as a fellow for this year, is a social historian who's plumbed the odiferous Geniza, I believe you said, to study cases of conversion to and from Judaism in Jewish communities in medieval Egypt and the Levant. He is working here this year on the question of who was a Sephardi, and today's talk is entitled To Be or Not to Be a Sephardi, the case of Rabbi Isaac ben Samuel.
So thank you very much, and thank you. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank again Ryan and Jeff and Kelsey and the entire staff and Mr. Frankel, and also, of course, thank the fellows for their comments on the earliest version of this presentation. I'm not as nihilist as I was 2 months ago, but it's a gradual process, so I still don't have final conclusions, of course, in line with what you said. So in my talk today, I would like to tell the story of an Iberian migrant and his descendants, and through their story to tackle issues of identity and identification, migration and integration, and of course, what it meant to be identified as Sephardi. All this by adopting a view from the East using the documents of the Cairo Geniza. Yitzhak ben Shmuel was the chief judge of the Jewish community of Fustat, Old Cairo, for 4 or 5 decades, from the end of the 11th century until at least 1127. Dozens of court records bearing his signature were discovered among the documents of the Cairo Geniza. In addition, the Geniza and other collections of Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic manuscripts have preserved various compositions of his in a variety of fields. A lengthy commentary on the former prophets, halachic compositions and commentaries on several Talmudic tractates, legal responsa, and liturgical poetry. He is rich over, spanning the major cornerstones of Andalusian Jewish literature, was characterized by present-day scholars as, quote, characteristic of the Spanish school. This modern identification stems from the fact that Yitzhak ben Shmuel himself attached to his name the appellation Sephardi, as you can see here, when signing court records that, as the ones that I mentioned before, as well as some of his compositions. So apparently, Yitzhak ben Shmuel was the quintessential Sephardi, or was he? The question is, of course, what do we mean by identifying someone as Sephardi? In my talk today, I will approach this question by examining how Iberian Jews who migrated to the Eastern Mediterranean during the 10th to the 13th centuries identified themselves and were identified by their contemporaries. In this, I'm following Brubaker's and Cooper's suggestion in their article Beyond Identity that we examine the larger and elusive issue of identity through a series of perspectives, among them the question of identification. I believe that examining the self-identification of migrants provides us with the opportunity to study how Sephardi identity was construed in times of personal changes like migration, how it was mediated and transmitted in new locales, and what it meant in those places. Cairo Geniza documents originate mostly from the 10th to the 13th centuries, clearly a crucial period in the history of Iberian Peninsula, its Jewish communities, and their evolving identities. These Geniza documents, alongside contemporaneous sources, provide us with a broader view of the ways in which Iberian migrants like Yitzhak ben Shmuel conveyed their identity. In other words, this path of research might reveal the extent to which the notion of Sephardi identity resonated beyond the intellectual elite and outside the Iberian Peninsula. So let's return now to Yitzhak ben Shmuel and see what his personal story can reveal about identification of Iberian migrants. The earliest dated document concerning Yitzhak ben Shmuel is from 1091. It is a flowery letter sent to him from none other than the Gaon Eviatar, the head of the Palestinian yeshiva. In this letter, Eviatar Gaon addresses Yitzhak as Bei Rabbanan, who is the head of the court, our Lord and Master Yitzhak the Great Rav. So it is clear that Yitzhak was already serving as a judge and an important public figure in Fustat at that time. However, we do not have any further information concerning his first steps in Egypt or the Eastern Mediterranean, not to mention his migration from the Iberian Peninsula or his origins there. And actually, we are not even sure if it was he who migrated or maybe his father. So by 1091, Yitzhak was already the chief judge of the largest and most important Jewish community in Egypt. Dated court documents signed by him are preserved from 1098 forward. However, in none of these documents did Yitzhak ben Shmuel sign as Sephardi or allude in any other way to his Iberian origins or identity. The Geniza documents establish that clearly that in the summer of 1106, Yitzhak still signed his name without any appellation, and that by late 1108, he had begun adding Sephardi to his signature. He continued to sign as Sephardi in the remaining 20-odd court documents preserved from the next 2 decades. So, what happened in 1107, 1108 that made him identify himself in these documents as Sephardi? Did Yitzhak experience a change of heart which caused him to embrace and exhibit his Latin Sephardic identity? Did he suddenly realize the importance of Sfarad, Al-Andalus, in Jewish history? One explanation is that it was a merely technical detail. Perhaps there was another Yitzhak ben Shmuel in town, and our Yitzhak needed something to clearly distinguish and define himself differently. I would like to dedicate a moment to rule out this possibility in the specific case of Yitzhak ben Shmuel, as well as partially reject the notions behind such a suggestion. So, in the case of Yitzhak ben Shmuel, we are simply not aware of any other person of any importance who was a contemporary of our Yitzhak and was called Yitzhak ben Shmuel. But even if there was such a person in Fustat, I doubt that it would have been the chief judge, an acclaimed scholar who would have had to come up with a new identity marker to distinguish himself. And even if we assume that this was indeed the case, it simply doesn't work, since for the identifier to be useful, it needs to be socially accepted. One should know who is meant when referring to the Sephardi or the astrologer or the bald one in the appropriate context. Yet in Yitzhak's case, his surrounding society almost never identified him as Sephardi in the surviving record. There are only 3 references to Yitzhak as Sephardi made by others, and 2 of them were written post-mortem. So the rest refer to him as the Rav, the judge, the chief judge, El-Kanzi, and the like. Now, I do acknowledge that the fact that identification is dependent on social context and specific circumstances. This is exactly my point. I would caution, though, against seeing identification as a purely technical matter, the best way to clearly differentiate and distinguish between people. Identification has a technical aspect to it, but it means more than efficiently recognizing people by differentiating them from one another. In fact, some identity markers, such as geographical origins, the Maghrebi, or cultural affiliation, the Babylonian, and I'm so I'm not saying if Sephardi is either or both, I don't know, are meant exactly to affiliate someone with the larger group, to associate him with others who are similar to him, or indeed to claim a shared identity. So Yitzhak ben Shmuel chose sometime between 1106 and 1108 to identify himself as a Sephardi. We do not know why, but we do know that it happened. This timing rules out the possibility that it was the actual immigration from Sfarad or settling in a new locale after a period of wandering, which led Yitzhak to adopt this appellation. It also cannot be attributed to a change in his reputation, social status, or official role, since by then he had served as Fustat's chief judge for many years. Whatever moved Yitzhak to begin identifying himself as such, he was quite consistent in this thereafter. 25 dated documents signed by him from the subsequent 2 decades all bear the appellation Sephardi in his signature. Now, inner feelings and deliberations are difficult to detect and decipher, certainly for the modern historians, but also for contemporaries of the figures we study. The signature, on the other hand, and especially that of a judge on a court document, is a public declaration, a performance of identity. Yitzhak chose to publicly identify himself as a Sephardi within his community. So, what was the response of his community members? Apparently, they were not too impressed. Several letters addressed to Yitzhak, some of them public petitions and admonitions, were also discovered in the Karo Beniza. They are all filled with almost every possible honorific title, but none identify Yitzhak ben Shmuel as a Sephardi, though he himself made it perfectly clear that his Sephardiness, whatever that meant to him, was part of his self-identification. Yitzhak's compositions are mentioned time and again. These are the documents, the letters I referred to before, and here are some of his compositions, copies of his compositions or references to him, and these are mentioned time and again in the 12th, in book lists, for example, from the 12th and the 13th centuries, as well as in legal treatises in which they are quoted, but in all of them he is called El-Kanzi, or the judge, but never Sephardi. What about Yitzhak's offspring? We know of 2 sons of Yitzhak ben Shmuel. One of them, Yosef, signed several court records as a witness, but in none of them does he identify himself or his father as a Sephardi. The other son, Chia, became a judge, and like his father, eventually became the chief judge of the Jewish community of Fustat. He too was active for a long period of time. The first extant court document he signed is from 1129, and he is still mentioned as the chief judge in a letter by Maimonides in 1170, more than 40 years later. More than a dozen documents which mention Chia ben Yitzhak have been discovered thus far in the Geniza. Court records he signs, letters addressed to him or mentioning him, and other documents. In none of these documents did Chia add the identification Sephardi to his name or to his father's. It is significant to note that at least during the first 15 years of Chia's communal activity, his father Yitzhak was still alive, which means that while the self-identified Sephardi father was alive and probably active, his son, who was active in the same court, most likely didn't care much about the Sephardiness, his Sephardiness, or at least did not bother to identify himself or his father as Sephardi through his signatures. Likewise, he was not identified as such by others. He is usually styled the Dayan, the judge, or Rabbana. There is one legal record from late in his career and long after his father died, in which Chia is mentioned as Rabbana Chia ben Rabbana Yitzhak HaSfaradi, which is actually the one that you see here, above, on top. And here, of course, Sephardi can either refer to him or to his father. There is one additional detail about the activity of Chia Hadayan, which is very important in the context of Sephardi culture, identity, and identification. Apparently, according to scholarly consensus, he is the same Chia Hadayan, Chia the judge, who compiled the first Diwan of Judah Levi. This hypothesis is supported by the recent discovery of letter drafts addressed to him by Chalfon ben Netanel, a well-known Egyptian merchant who sojourned for a lengthy period in Spain and was Judah Halevi's close associate. So, Chia was not only the son of a scholar who identified himself as Sephardi, but was also in close contact with a prominent figure in the Egyptian Andalusian Jewish network, and was the compiler of the Diwan of one of the most important and best known Andalusian poets. Yet, even as the compiler of the Diwan, he is not identified by later generations as Sephardi. On the contrary, when the second is identified as the Maghribi. And in the second editor of the Diwan, he explains why Chia was the best suited person for the job. He notes that he, that is Chia, was from his west, min Gharbihi, from the west of Judah Levi. So he thus locates, geographically locating both Chia and Halevi using the broad geographic term the west, Maghrib, rather than using the narrower, more precise Hebrew terms Farad and Sephardi. Yitzhak ben Shmuel's choice of identification is unique only in the amount of documents available to us, not in its details. The main features of his identity and identification are clearly similar to those of other people documented in the Cairo Geniza, as I will demonstrate presently. Yitzhak's Sephardi identity, as can be discerned through his study of his identification, was fluid, contingent, and performative. It was not given or fixed, neither for him nor for his surrounding society, including his sons. Most importantly, Yitzhak's identification as a Sephardi was not total, but rather was only one aspect, and not the most important one, of his overall identity or identification. Over the next few minutes, I will discuss the technicalities of the identifier Sephardi, since these technical details of identification can also tell us something about the more elusive question of identity. I will argue that, much like what we can say about Yitzhak, the identification of Iberian migrants as Sephardim was haphazard, dependent on social context, on language and genre when dealing with written documents, and above all on personal choices and idiosyncrasies. This accords with the silence of Geniza documents in regard to specifically Andalusian customs, appearances or dialect, and the lack of any evidence in the Cairo Geniza of Andalusi communal organization in the East, or Andalusi-based networks of migrants. My claim is that in the medieval Eastern Mediterranean, the geographical identifier Sephardi was yet to carry the cultural statements and associations it later evolved to represent. This is why people were inconsistent in their usage of it. They could identify themselves as Sephardim. They could exchange Sephardi for Andalusi. They could instead use a local identifier, or they could lose it altogether. Whatever they chose was not binding, neither for them nor for the Eastern Mediterranean people amongst whom they lived, nor even for their own descendants. First, as the case of Yitzhak clearly demonstrates, not all Iberian migrants identified themselves as Sephardim to begin with. Even those who did not always identify themselves as such, and regardless of the degree of their consistency, the fact that someone identified himself as a Sephardi did not necessarily mean that this identification was fixed or that it was accepted by his contemporaries. Several people who are mentioned in the Genizan documents as bearing Iberian names, and thus probably hailing from the Iberian Peninsula, for example, Ben Capron, Ben Satlon, even Ben Shaprut, not like a person 200 years later, were not explicitly identified as Sephardim. And people who sign as Sephardi in one document could sign another document without such an identification. In cases where we have only a handful of references to a certain individual, we cannot be sure if the lack of identification as a Sephardi, or indeed the use of such an identification, is intentional or not. Nor do we have enough information about the circumstances. But cases like that of Yitzhak ben Shmuel make it clear that some Iberian Jews who migrated to the East did not identify themselves at all as Sephardim. This is not to say that they concealed this biographic detail, but just that in their eyes it did not merit enough importance to be included, for example, in their signature. Another aspect of this fluidity is apparent in the language. In the language. When an Iberian migrant did choose to identify himself using his geographic origin, he still had several options to choose from. First of all, between the Hebrew identifier Sephardi and the Arabic Andalusi. As is well known, the equation of Islamic Al-Andalus with the biblical Sfarad was a powerful weapon in the hands of Jewish Andalusi intellectual elite when propagating the concept of Andalusi uniqueness and exceptionalism. The fact that ordinary people in the Eastern Mediterranean were identifying themselves as hailing from Sfarad in Hebrew as early as the first years of the 11th century shows that the equation Al-Andalus and Sfarad was by then well known and widely accepted. At the same time, the Geniza documents show that Andalusi was a more prevalent identification than Sephardi, though this could change as Geniza research continues to reveal new documents. Even those Iberians who signed or were identified as Sephardi in one document could be identified elsewhere as Andalusi. For example, in this example, the above is Judeo-Arabic court deed, Abraham ben Shmuel el-Andalusi. And it's the same person, it's a very interesting story of his inheritance, and you see it's Hebrew document, so it's Avraham Levi bar Shmuel bar Avraham HaSfaradi. We have several documents so we can see it's consistent regarding to this person. So a careful analysis shows that these two identifiers were interchangeable, and it was largely the linguistic context which determined the use of Sephardi or Andalusi. In Hebrew or Aramaic documents, the identifier is always, in the documents so far discovered, HaSfardi. Yet in Judeo-Arabic context, it is almost always Al-Andalusi. One could argue that this interchangeability suggests that by the 11th century, when Jews applied the identifier Andalusi, they already had in mind the cultural claims associated with Sfarad and Sephardi. This is possible, yet the easiness with which people were willing to lose the Hebrew identifier Sephardi with its possible biblical associations, seen within the context of the general fluidity and laxity in the usage of these identifiers, suggests that for these people, these identifiers did not carry the same associations and assumptions that the intellectual elite had in mind. Whether Sephardi or Andalusi, these two identifiers both imply an identity which is not local but regional, not related to a certain city but to the Iberian Peninsula as a whole, or at least to the Islamic territories. It also excludes North Africa, which together with Al-Andalus formed the Maghreb, the West. Yet, as we've seen, some Iberians could be identified as Maghrebis, like Chia the Dayan, the compiler of Judah Levi's Diwan, if we accept that he is the son of Yitzhak ben Shmuel Sephardi. Another Iberian who identified himself as Maghrebi is a Karaite scholar who resided in Jerusalem in the 1040s. In one Hebrew letter, he signed as HaSfardi, Moshe ben Yitzhak HaSfaradi, Shochain B'Yerushalayim, above. And in another one, written in Judeo-Arabic, he signs in Arabic characters as Maghrebi. The identification of many Iberian migrants by using a regional identifier, Andalusi or Sephardi, suggests that it was considered a distinct and separate region, which generated a shared identity of some kind, at least for purposes of identification. Yet, it certainly was not the only option. Several examples show that locating one's origins in a specific city within the Iberian Peninsula was at least equally meaningful for some. Even far away from the peninsula, on the eastern side of the Mediterranean, some people saw value in identifying themselves as El-Wadiyashi, for example, above. That is coming from Wadi Ash, Etulatuli, El-Yusani, Edani, El-Mayurki, and so forth, and even a second generation, Ben and Dani. We have several of these. These were not only self-identifications, but were also used by their surrounding Eastern society. This means that, unlike the case of Yitzhak ben Shmuel, at least in these cases, a local identifier was how those people were identified, even far away from their hometown, and even many years after their migration and integration in the East. In several instances, we even have a double identification, both regional and local. As you can see, both the two bottom examples, HaSfaradi El-Yusani on the left and Batalusi El-Andalusi on the right. The importance of local identity of Iberian migrants beyond the question of identification is manifested in several other instances. In a letter written by a Toledan migrant residing in Jerusalem to his sister back in Toledo, he mentions our people, the Andalusians, Ashabuna el-Andalusiyin, above, who are all doing well, using a broad regional identification. But when he turns to specific news, he also employs a local identifier. He reports that a person named El-Majriti, that is from Madrid, and his sister have died. Therefore, he writes, there is no one left for the people of Madrid here, all gone. which means that beyond the regional identification as Andalusians, these migrants were also known by their local origin. And it seemed important enough to note that no one was left from their certain local origin. Later on in the same letter, the writer mentions the women from Toledo. You see it below. As collectively active in a communal dispute. Similarly, another Iberian merchant advises his associate, who were not Iberians themselves, quote, "You would have the best chance with people either from Toledo or from Madrid." He is looking for news, which suggests that people were known and could be easily identified by their local origin, even when traveling in the East. The importance of local identity and that group of migrants organized or were identified based on their specific local origin back in the Iberian Peninsula should not come as a surprise, neither in the Iberian context nor in the Eastern one. Menachem Ben Sasson writes that, I quote, "The demarcation of local identity was one of the most important signs of identity in the Eastern Geniza society. This identity can be seen in migrants' nicknames. It is apparent in their patterns of dwelling. It is a key to understand their actions and interests. It is not just a title to distinguish one group from the other." I end the quote from Ben Sasson. And of course, I'm thinking about Jonathan Ray's work, 13th century onwards, so maybe this is a clue for before the 13th century in Muslim Al-Andalus. The point of groups of migrants organizing according to geographic origins brings us to the question, did those Iberian migrants who identify themselves as Sephardi or Andalusi also form Andalusian groups and networks to promote their interests or to preserve their culture? As far as we can tell based on Geniza documents, the answer is negative. We have no evidence to suggest that Iberian migrants were socially distinct as Iberians in their accent, dialect, costume, or customs. Obviously, there were such differences, as well as more general markers distinguishing between Maghrebis, including Iberians and others, yet they were apparently not important enough to merit attention in the documentary Geniza. The inclusion of the Iberians within the larger group of Maghrebis is important. The Maghrebis are an example of migrants who did form a kind of social subgroup which is distinguishable in Geniza documents. They are repeatedly referred to in the plural, the Maghariba, as acting together in communal affairs, as a group of people who were identified based on their origin and who acted jointly for the interests of their collective group, even many years after their migration and successful integration in Geniza society. Furthermore, among these Maghariba, we may find Iberian migrants, such as Abraham HaKohen el-Andalusi, or Yosha ben Natan, who was identified sometimes as an Andalusi and sometimes as Sephardi. They were both active among the Maghariba in the middle of the 11th century, when the Maghrebis were a key faction in communal disputes both in Egypt and in Palestine. This is yet another example of the weakness of the Sephardi Andalusi option as the main feature of identity in the time and place discussed. The local city on the one hand, or the super-regional Maghreb on the other hand, made much more sense as points of references for individuals and collective identity. To sum up, an examination of the identifier Sephardi and other related geographic identifiers among Iberian migrants in the Eastern Mediterranean revealed the extent and limits of the notion of Sephardi uniqueness among those migrants. On the one hand, we see that already in the early 11th century, Sfarad and Sephardi are recognized identifiers, interchangeable with Al-Andalus and Andalusi, and that people not necessarily related to the intellectual Iberian elite could and did choose to be identified in the context of their daily lives as Sephardim. On the other hand, we see the Iberian migrants employ this identified in different ways. It could be changed to the Arabic Andalusi, thereby losing its biblical resonance. It could also be added to or even replaced by a local identifier. It could be substituted by the super-regional Maghrebi identifier, and it could be abandoned altogether. This suggests that in that time and place, the Eastern Mediterranean during the 11th to the 13th centuries, the term Sephardi was not yet laden with all the intellectual and cultural associations and claims which it later came to represent. In Fatimid and Ayyubid, Egypt and the Levant, this geographical cultural identifier was but one of several identity markers a person could deploy. The use of this identifier was contingent upon many factors, some of which we can reconstruct, such as language or genre of document, but in many cases it seems that the choice was dependent on personal preferences, which varied not only from one person to another, but between several documents written by the same person. This pattern corresponds with other aspects of that society we have noted, the almost complete lack of reference in Geniza documents to a Sephardi and Andalusi distinctiveness in clothing or dialect or religious customs, and the absence of any evidence of Sephardim organizing as a distinctive group. In conclusion, while the notion of Sephardi uniqueness certainly existed in the Iberian Peninsula during the discussed period, at least among the intellectual elite, it seems that in the Eastern Mediterranean, this identity was still flexible and vague enough to be used intermittently, altered, or even abandoned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Moshe, for a wonderful paper. And so I see Miriam first.
Moshe, I want to say exactly the same thing as wonderful paper. But I do have a question. My understanding from what you said here is that Sephardi had the same connotation as Sfarad, somebody from Sfarad, or it was often that. And Sfarad, we heard from Brann how Sfarad was used as a place name, as a geographical place. So you mentioned that Yitzchak ben Shmuel may have been, when he referred to himself as Yitzchak ben Shmuel Hasfaradi, he could have been referring to his father. It's not clear whether he migrated or whether his father and mother migrated. But I wonder if you have other cases in which you can show that somebody was actually a descendant who was born to immigrants from Sfarad. Because otherwise, it just strikes me that we have no reason to think that it's used other than as a geographical identifier. If it doesn't pass on to another generation.
Right.
Yeah. So this is why I didn't want to exclude the possibility that he was already born in the East. We have examples of people who were born outside of the Iberian Peninsula and were called Sephardim. We have in Sicily. There's a family where like 4 or 5 generations of them we know from the Ginsburg, from like the entire span of the 11th century, and they're all called known as Al-Andalusi, and also in 1 or 2 documents Sfaradim. And we can trace like the whole family. Goitan wrote about them also, Olivia Constable. And so there are definitely Andalusi who were born in Sicily or in Tunis, not in the Iberian Peninsula.
Yeah, thank you very much, Moshe. But your lecture and this story about Isaac ben Samuel remind me the well-known anecdote about Yehudi Menuhin. How did he get this this very unique name, Yehudi? So the story goes, as far as I know it, is that his parents moved to a new neighborhood just before he was born, and one of the neighbors tell them this is a very good neighborhood. There's no Jews here. So that's what they made. So it came to my mind. Maybe our Isaac he heard some offensive remark about the Sephardim, and then he decided that he will be recall himself as a Sephardi.
Yeah, like I said, I cannot say what happened to him specifically, but it's interesting that he is not. He decided, or it just it happened that he didn't identify himself as Sephardi.
Because there is probably no tensions. As you said, there is no tensions between the locals and the Sephardim, but somehow maybe they started the tension. Something happened that this tension started, and then he wanted actually to identify himself as a Sephardi, that he didn't feel any necessity before. Yeah.
Could be, although we have other persons who at the same period more or less who do identify themselves as Sephardi or Andalusi or as a local identifier, and maybe others who do not. at all, even after the alleged, the hypothesis of attention, rising tension. So I just can't tell.
Yeah. Cannot tell for sure.
Jeff.
Just kind of a simple question, but how did other people identify themselves who weren't from Sfarad or any I guess people who came from other regions, for instance,
Migrants.
the locals, are they also using the local geography?
So yeah, we have plenty of geographical identifiers, like geographical nisbas in the Geniza. Some are like regional, like Maghrebi, and some are local. And also, for example, if you have someone coming from Iraq, he can be identified, if he identifies as Iraqi, so maybe it's more geographical. If he is identified as Habavli, maybe it's not only geographical but also cultural. And then if you see someone who is identified as Habavli, does it mean that he came from Babylonia or that he adheres to the Babylonian rite? And even more complicated when you see the same person in a Judeo-Arabic document, he is called El-Baghdadi, but the same person in the Hebrew document is called Habavli. So what do we do with that? So we have plenty of these geographical identifiers, and also, of course, other identifiers.
And then just to follow up, is there any evidence that any of those people see themselves as a united group, that they socialize in social networks from Maghrebi?
So I think the most important example, the prominent example is the Maghrebi example of the 11th century. In most of the 11th century, there was a group of Maghrebis active, and it's definitely that those who are well integrated, but they're still Maghrebis, and there are newcomers, and they join this specific subgroup.
And the Sham?
What?
Sham is?
But Sham is is he really from a Sham and migrated, or he is just a member of the Shami community?
As well.
So yeah, but this, because here in the Maghreb we clearly that these are migrants and descendant of migrants. If it's Shami versus Iraqi Babylonian, you start to question: is it really a person, a person who personally migrated, or he adheres to this or that right of the Shamis or the Babylonians? We also have some cases of local immigrants, but it's later. In the 13th century, we find people from Ashkelon, of all places, who still identify and act jointly and have a cantor while in exile from Ashkelon. But this is 13th century, it's later.
Yes, please.
So on this triangle, Sephardi, Andalusi, Maghreb, do we ever have a sense that Sephardi is used to indicate someone from south, straight to Gibraltar? In other words, we tend to think of Andalus straddling that and Maghreb can straddle that, but Sepharad in common parlance doesn't. It seems to be the Iberian Peninsula and perhaps north as we go up the story.
Yeah. So it's for that I need to have a person who has double identifiers, right?
Do we?
No, because we have not too many, and we also do not have anyone. Again, the very few cases, but the very few cases that we have from Christian, pre-Reconquista Christian Spain, Christian Iberian Peninsula, they are not referred to as Sephardim.
Right.
So Sepharad is Al-Andalus, but including Toledo and including these other parts.
Interesting. Just see where we're at here. Well, we have a few minutes, and so I'm wondering if there are any questions from either paper right now. Please.
Yeah, just to follow up on a linguistic point,
Oh, sure.
Maimonides would use in the Andalus,
Mhm.
right? Our practice in Andalusia, and also would say the Maghreb, or in the Maghreb, and it's sort of the sharp distinction between Hebrew and Arabic is not kept here because if he has Maghreb and Maghreb are interchangeable almost. Well, West can mean Andalus. It can also mean very much more broadly, a broader confusion, I think, in those two terms.
So
he uses Maghreb to mean only Andalus, but also in Arabic and in Hebrew. I think he's.
You refer to Blau's article. I understood it differently. We have cases where he refers specifically to a rite or a use of language that is specific to Al-Andalus, and he says Al-Andalus, or that he says Maghreb. But also there are some cases where he says in the Nafil Maghreb, but the custom or the language he referred to is specifically Andalusian.
Right.
So again we see him identifying interchangeably Indana, our place, as either just the peninsula or the West in general.
Hmm.
And although nobody will question that he is, Sephardi.
Remember, you have rabbinic figures from North Africa who are moving to Andalus, so it may be interchangeable. If he's thinking about a tradition from Alfasi, so it originates in North Africa, but it lands in Andalus.
Yeah.
So I think Maimonides' usage is peculiar, maybe peculiar to him and the time.
And again, the genre, because he's the legal genre. So
Right. He's just talking about legal tradition.
Right, but that would be the case with Yitzhak Ben Shmuel too, as a Dayan, no?
yeah, but for Yitzhak Ben Shmuel, we only have only his signatures,
Right.
but in
Right.
personal documents, commercial documents of other persons. So it's a different context, a different genre.
Interesting. Wow. And right.
So also, just for me, the key distinction about this data, between this data and what we're asking about, really, when we ask about post-1492, is the idea of elitism, of being a member of a group which is proud, which thinks of itself as better than other groups, which doesn't let other people in, which says, we are the cream of the crop, or other types of elitism. And I think that it's clear, and correct me if I'm wrong, that these, even if they have pride in origin or in group, they're certainly not thinking of themselves as ultra elite or as exclusive or being seen that way even more by the people around them. Am I right in thinking
This is what I think we can see in the documents, and of course you can say, these people that we find in the Geniza documents were the people that were integrated into the society which deposited its documents in the Geniza, right? So, and they intermarried and they worked together with the Maccabees and with the Easterners. Perhaps there was another group. We can postulate a lot of options, but we do not have the evidence from the Geniza documents to show that they were segregated themselves or segregated by others.
Mediterranean society. It was one culture.
Yeah.
Interesting. So let me hand it over to Ryan now and thank both Moshe and Ross for and everyone here for a wonderfully stimulating session. Thank you so much.